right, good evening. So thank you for all joining us this evening. Tonight we're here to talk about water, and more specifically, how water plays a pivotal role in the way that we mitigate and adapt to climate change. Climate change is projected to increase the number of water-stressed regions and exacerbate shortages already. And so by 2050, the number of people at risk of floods will increase from its current level of 1.2 billion to 1.6 billion. And in the early to mid 2010s, 1.9 billion, or 27% of the global population, lived in water scarce areas. By 2050, this number will increase to between 2.7 to 3.2 billion people. So we have three experts and remarkable founders who are here to help us learn more. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to thank our wonderful friends at Bold who have helped us put this evening together, and as many of the other events that we've done for Impact, and our Impact board members, Rekia Fudel and Natalie Baer, who organized this event. So first, let's move on to our speakers. I'd like to introduce Spencer Glyndon. Spencer is a renowned economist, climate activist, and senior fellow at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. He's also the founder of Probable Futures, which launched yesterday. So congratulations to Spencer on this incredible endeavor, and we're going to hear more about that this evening. But just as a quick synopsis, Probable Futures makes local and global projections of heat, drought, wildfire, and other variables available for free to anyone in the world. Incredible mission. Next, I'd like to introduce Marla Nilsson-Smith. Marla spent the past 30 years in the water sector and has set out to change the world with accountable solutions and advocacy. Marla is the founder and executive director of Water First, a nonprofit organization that helps governments and global stakeholders realign and mitigate risk and waste to ultimately try to solve for the $5 billion in funds that is squandered in impoverished communities around the world annually. And we also have with us this evening, Dal AVANT. Dal is an award-winning tech entrepreneur and author and globally recognized expert on clean water and sustainability. Dal is the founder and CEO of Aquagenuity, the world's first intelligent water quality database. Aquagenuity's database platform incorporates big data, predictive analytics, and blockchain technology to predict and prevent water shortages and water-related public health crises. So many thanks to the three of you for being here with us. My name is Kimberly Hall. I'm on the board of the Impact Public Service Fund and your host this evening. So before we dive into the conversation, we have a presentation by Spencer on the risks posed by climate change. The other speakers and myself will go off video, and I will turn the share over to you, Spencer.
Right. Thank you. Can you see somebody make a noise or panic in some way? All right, we're good.
We can see you.
Great. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you today, or if you're watching this later, whenever. Welcome to my home. We don't wear shoes in my house, so if you're still wearing shoes, feel free to take them off. I'm here to talk to you about why we are unprepared and share some of the work my team and I have done so that we can lead to a conversation with these excellent panelists that I'm proud to be sharing the event with. And as the slide says here, we are unprepared. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit because I know this audience is full of young people who are pursuing graduate degrees. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I evolved and why, because it's relevant for the work I do, and maybe it'll be informative for you. This is a map of southeastern Michigan from the mid-1980s. I was born in 1969, and on the left side of this map, you see the town of Ann Arbor, which is where the University of Michigan is, and I was born. My family lived on the outskirts of Ann Arbor, but to the right on this map, you see Detroit. And where I lived, things went well, and to the right on this map, in Detroit, things were very difficult. People suffered. There was violence. There was a lot of change and suffering. And I was obsessed with essentially two questions, because that's where my grandparents lived. My mother had lived. All the people I knew came from Detroit. All of our media was there. And Detroit made me ask two questions. The first of which was what promotes prosperity. Now, many of you are in business school. Essentially, that is the question of business school, is how can I be prosperous? It's an American question, if ever there was one. But also I was interested in its opposite, which is what causes catastrophe, which frankly is very little studied in America, and tragically so. And I'm going to explain to you why that is tragic. I became very interested in what creates bad outcomes. And so I did a lot of things. I was lucky and privileged to have access to education and also to opportunity. I worked on the south side of Chicago, in Russia, in China, in Germany, and I wound up getting a PhD in economic history. Later on, I wound up in finance, overseeing research in one of the biggest investment firms in the world, and I started working to understand the role of climate, mostly just because I was curious. I hadn't thought much about it. And it forced me to ask a question I had never even considered, which is, why did humans settle at all? And it turns out that settlement is a very interesting thing, and it is fundamental to the way we think about the world. Settlement requires the ability to plan, and you need to stay in place so you can save, invest, specialize, develop libraries and theaters and all kinds of other things that we all take for granted, but also that are what makes life special. And that settlement requires stability. What I learned for the first time in my 40s was that a stable climate is the foundation for all of civilization. The ability to expect what's coming is implicit in all the buildings here in Paris. The plants, the HVAC systems, the architecture, all of them assume a climate that is stable. And that was okay, because these buildings were mostly built in the late 18th century. And for the preceding 12,000 years, here going back to 10,000 BC, the climate had been stable. This is actually a graph of temperature annually going back to 10,000 BC. And the data comes from ice in Antarctica, which keeps a good record. And what you see is that the climate, there were warmer years and colder years. There were some little waves and wiggles, but basically it was very, very narrow. And in fact, this record is a noisier record than average. It's only one place. But this shows how stable climate was. But why did settlement only happen then? Well, because before then, the climate was not stable. Our earliest ancestors, people just like you and me, emerged about 200,000 years ago into a world that was wildly unstable. And they had to follow good weather. That's why they were nomadic. And they only settled in about 9,500 BC. That's the first evidence we have of what we would call civilization, because before then, they couldn't afford to. It was unpredictable. So you see that we've lived for the last 12,000 years in a stable environment that was unprecedented before. But even the before times were more stable than the previous times. And so I've now put on this graph going all the way back to 100 million years ago. And you think, well, that's totally irrelevant, except that actually, children are obsessed with dinosaurs often, and dinosaurs lived back there 80 to 100 million years ago. And at that time, there's a reason there were no humans around. It was too hot and humid for us. It was lizards and birds and all kinds of organisms that take in heat as opposed to us who need to offload heat. And so if I put those bands back on, what you can see is now as the climate warms, we are leaving the bounds of civilization, and we are threatening to leave the bounds of stability altogether. And there is no reason it can't keep on warming. There is no inherent stopping point that just happens to be there. This stability we took for granted is not assured. And so what I want to talk about is how a warming world will bring instability to civilization, not just to business or the economy, but to the way we live. And you're all people who are comfortable with math. There are three ideas here that I want to share with you. One is sample bias. The other is the end of stationarity. And the last is model uncertainty. And you, our society, and perhaps especially professors, are unprepared. And why? Because they learned and developed disciplines during a time when everything went well. And that's this sample bias. Sample bias is when maybe you're now in your 50s and there were no world wars, markets spread everywhere. We can barely remember the 70s when there was inflation and there was one financial crisis. This environment tells you that actually life's pretty smooth. It may be bad for many people and there's lots of injustice, but there's actually not big turmoil. And as a result, you see models, you see predictions of the future that are also smooth. So the most famous models in climate science that are used most frequently about economics come from William Nordhaus at Yale, who won the Nobel Prize and who should not have. His models all start with taking the late 20th century and smoothly predicting that everyone will get rich, essentially no matter how warm it gets. And his idea is that, well, later we'll be richer, so we'll fix the climate then. And you see here that income per capita globally around the world, he expects to get to over $100,000 in this century, and at temperatures that are much warmer than now. The end of stationarity, well, unlike economic models, climate science, starting 40 years ago, predicted a suite of variables that would change. They said, this is how the world will change. Nights won't cool off, later winter, earlier spring, melting glaciers and sea ice, more drought and downpour, more wildfire. None of these things had precedent, and the science got it all right. So my goal is to bring these valuable variables into the world in ways that are tractable and vivid, and use mankind's first good forecast. And so what is coming? Let me show you some maps. And these maps are all available interactively on probablefutures.org. So here is a map of the number of days below freezing. And this map is of a snapshot of between 1970 and 2000. You see in the top left, it says 0.5 degrees C. That's when the world was 0.5 degrees C above that long-term average. And what I'm going to do now is warm up the go from 0.5 to 1 degree C, which was 2017 or so, 1.5, which is very soon, 2, 2.5, and 3 degrees C, which we hope to avoid. And you'll see how the number of days that are freezing goes down. And why don't you start by looking at sort of the southeast of the United States. Dahl is in Atlanta. You can look at Atlanta or look up to New Haven. See how as the earth warms, the number of days below freezing shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. The green is less than a week. The dark gray is 0. And what happens as this happens is climate's changing. Agriculture changes. Infrastructure is going to be challenged. If you want an example of this that links to water, let's go to the West. So on the Probable Futures tool, you can choose any place and it will show you the data underlying with the average, which is in the dark, the big letters, numbers, and then the 10th and 90th percentile. And you can see that here, this is in Utah, and all of the snow in Utah winds up in California and Arizona. What happens as the earth warms is that snow, which irrigates half of America's vegetables and fruits, all of the drinking water and other water for that whole area, it relies on snow, not on rain. Snow, which melts over the course of the summer, and those number of days shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, so that the abundance of water, the supply of water that feeds all of the country will change radically as it warms. In terms of drought, this is the annual likelihood of an extreme drought, a drought that happened less than once every 1,000 years, becomes nearly annual. And I want you to look at the Mediterranean basin here, Spain, Italy. See what happens as we reach 1.5, how frequent these droughts become. The orange colors are more than half the time. And if we go all the way to 2.5 or 3, it becomes a permanent state of affairs. Something that never happened before happens virtually every year. And you see it in Southern Australia, where people live, in South Africa. And if we go back now to where I showed you before, the Southwest of the United States and Mexico becomes a fraught place filled with drought. This is just at 1.5 degrees C. And this is a map essentially of where there are already fires, because heat pulls moisture out of the water and creates, out of the soil and creates fire. And so the last issue is model uncertainty and nonlinearity, which is these are images of what happens in a time horizon and a climate space that we can foresee, but there is a risk of much more uncertainty after that, much more instability, because we used to live in a world that balanced itself out. It needed no maintenance. We are now in a world that we can maintain if we dedicate resources to it. But we're rapidly approaching a point where the world will be moving itself. The biotic systems will be creating more heat. So 20 years ago, climate scientists had a list of things that were unlikely to happen, but if they happened, it would be terrible. And in the last few years, all of those events have started unfolding. What I want you to see on this page is the second section there. The following are thought to be extremely unlikely below 2 degrees C. The decline of Arctic sea ice, the disappearance of glaciers on land, thawing permafrost, and large-scale forest fires, all of which would make the Earth heat more. They are feedback loops. Unfortunately, now we're going to go back to those maps and see how those changes might impact those. So freezing days. I want you to look at northern Canada or Scandinavia or Russia. You pick your northern latitude and look how winter goes from being a permanent state of affairs to a season. And so there are many, many, many more days where it is warm. And as a result, there are now, for the first time, fires in the far northern reaches. And you say, well, who is setting these fires? Well, this brings me to my cover slide. This is a picture of lightning in Alaska. And Alaska never used to have lightning ever. This is unprecedented, but there's now so much energy in the air that lightning is starting fires. And in terms of drought, I want you to look at South America, where the Amazon is, and see how drought has already begun and is now intensifying. And if we allow climate change to go further, will intensify to the point where the Amazon will also burn. It is already starting in ways that it had never done before. And this is a systemic risk. These are the things we run risking. And we are now leaning into this risk. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere keeps rising. Methane keeps rising very quickly, largely due to fracking. And people keep moving to Florida. People keep moving into hot, unstable places. And so what I'm doing is trying to make this work vivid and resonant and reach people. I spend time with influential institutions on a pro bono basis to help them change their norms and standards. I developed Probable Futures that I hope you'll visit. And I'm trying to collaborate with scientists to ask relevant questions about the future. And so what I tell CEOs, chief risk officers, and other leaders is to think of climate like money and information. It is ubiquitous, it is essential, and it is tractable. Water is part of that. The second is ask with every decision, am I increasing or decreasing risk? And last, collaborate with others. We have to change the rules because this is a public goods problem. So I know this is hard, but it's also simple. It's going to require imagination and it will require courage, but those are the things that make life special. And so that's my message to CEOs and chief risk officers and to governors and presidents. It's also my message to you. So thank you, and let me hand it back over to the panel.
Thank you so much, Spencer, for taking your time to share that with all of us. I mean, it really set the stage for our conversation. And one of the quotes that stood out to me was, I wrote it down here. We used to live in a world that needed no maintenance, and we now live in a world that where we can maintain if we dedicate resources to it quickly. And this is certainly true, arguably, of our most important resource, water. So again, thank you all for joining us this evening. If you've joined us in the middle of the presentation, we have 3 incredibly knowledgeable experts with us, so let's dive in. And if you have questions as we go, please put them in the Q&A chat at the bottom of your Zoom. So the average citizen hears a lot about heat, floods, fires. Why isn't water scarcity and water sustainability a bigger part of the climate change conversation? And, Dal or Marla, I'll pass that over to you to start.
I'll start by saying science, right? We typically kind of are driven by headlines and kind of whatever's in the news, but the narrative, and more specifically the science behind the narratives, sometimes gets buried below those headlines. So this is a very kind of straight line connection between, water quality. Just think about temperature. Everybody knows that if it's hot, water is going to evaporate. If it's cooler temperatures, things just change, right? The amount of rain, more rain that we're seeing, hurricanes, things like that, right? It's because temperatures are fluctuating. So just a very simple kind of straight line logic between climate change and water, we don't always get, just because we don't always follow science.
And Marla, what have you've been in the water space for over 30 years. What are you seeing? Has movement or interest in water increased? Why?
Well, I'd say for the people that I work with, so I work in communities in Central America and Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. And for them, interest in water has been at a crisis level for decades. In those communities, they've they've been living through the impact of that half degree that Spencer mentioned, climate change for many years, long before fires and droughts were routine events here in the United States. They've experienced unpredictable weather, water scarcity, lower crop productivity, sea level rise. These have all been major concerns for people in places like Bangladesh and Honduras long before we started talking about it in our households. So we're now seeing increased stress in the regions where we work, more forced internal migration from rural areas to cities and beyond. I'd say here in the United States, when I started doing this work 30 years ago, most people had no idea that literally billions of people didn't have access to something so basic as water, and the resulting toll in terms of, the labor effort to collect water or, preventable diseases like diarrhea. I believe that most people now do understand that this is a significant issue impacting people living in poverty, and that climate change is intensifying this crisis.
I'd say two things to echo what both Dal and Marla said. One is I'm sharing. So I learned a lot of stuff about engineering and economics, and then recently learned about science. And what I discovered about it was climate science is quite intuitive. Like the physical world we live in the way Dal describes, is actually really intuitive. It's not about. It's great that we have complex climate models that can predict temperature and do these other things, but our understanding of it is, if you have a human body and you use it, you can understand humidity, you can understand dryness, you can understand a number of things. You can understand if you wear dark clothing as opposed to light clothing, you absorb more energy. So why does Arctic sea ice matter? Because if there's less of it, the Earth gets darker and absorbs more energy. And so there's a little bit of compounding. Compounding is an idea that's prevalent in business, prevalent in finance. And so I'll give you a fact that I didn't know, but I'm happy to share, which is that every 1 degree centigrade warmer, or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer that the air gets, it holds 7% more moisture. This means that if the air is 10 degrees warmer, it holds 100% more moisture because it's compounding. So 10 degrees warmer air holds 100% more water. And so if you look at Atlanta or you look at Seattle, where Dal and Marla are, as their temperatures rise, what happens is showers become less common and downpours become more common. And so seeing the world as intuitive, as something we can understand with our own bodies, I would say water's gotten too little attention, but I would just say the physical world has gotten too little attention. And that same awareness of the physical world will make you pay attention to water by making you pay attention to the place you live as not being just a place filled with magic, but actually with physical forces. And I'd say one other thing about what Marla said is that poor communities, vulnerable communities, are aware of uncertainty and unpredictability in a way that wealthy and rich places are not. But that's partly less true now, especially in the United States, because the United States has invested so little and so poorly in infrastructure, in public goods. And this idea that there should be public goods that on top of which, so we're speaking largely to business school students today, business exists on top of an infrastructure of civility, of civilization, a set of rules and norms that businesses don't create. And if you don't have that public infrastructure below you, you don't have businesses, you don't have business schools. But if you have it, what happens is people rapidly forget about it, stop thinking about it. And so an awareness of the physical and awareness of the public are what's necessary to fix these problems. And so I think that that's also very doable and intuitive. But until that infrastructure started to get challenged here, Americans liked to believe that they lived in a magical place where they didn't have to take care of the public sphere. They could just focus on the private sphere.
What all of you are speaking about is really, that we're living in an interconnected system, right? So the rising sea level, the warmer oceans, the less snow and ice that you mentioned, Spencer, more droughts and wildfires, changing rain and snow patterns, et cetera, et cetera. So But the interesting thing about that, as I was starting to prepare for this evening and speaking with you all, is that our interconnected system is also really a story about the water cycle on this planet. So how can someone who's not an expert in this space make sense of that and understand that this is really a story about our water system? And I'll kick that over to you, Marla, first on how this is really impacting, how this is impacting people, in their day-to-day lives.
So I guess my first response is I think a lot of people understand maybe how they directly interact with the water cycle. That, for example, when you take a shower in the morning, that water started off as snow in the mountains. I really wish people had a better understanding of their indirect water uses, that everything that we use, wear, sell, buy, and eat takes water to make. I was just vacationing last week in Teton National Park and discovered that Jackson Lake, which is in the middle of the park, is drawn down about 30 or 35 feet this summer in order to provide water to neighboring Idaho's potato farmers and to grow crops for nourishing the cattle. I want people to understand those relationships with water and not just, that you need to have a low flow valve on your shower. We need to do more. Our partners, again, I work with poor communities around the world, and we're providing education to communities where we're building new water systems so that they understand the relationship between the water that they drink and cook and bathe with and trees on the watershed. And I've seen this education translated into these amazing skits by kids who are advocating to protect their forests when outsiders want to cut them down. I've seen this education put into direct use in households. Communities start to use more efficient cook stoves, practice soil conservation on their farmlands. They work with neighboring communities to protect entire watersheds, including protesting against government and corporate interests. So, I think part of the solution is that people do understand the more comprehensive water cycle and how they interact with it directly and indirectly.
And what about in the communities that you work with?
Yeah, we started a program a couple years ago before the plague. I call it the plague, the world ended here, but called Guardians of H2O. And it really deals with, the United Nations has the SDGs. Number 6, obviously, is clean water, although to me, all of them are about water. And Target 6B specifically talks about activating and engaging local communities, right, around monitoring water and wastewater, which is just not a thing, right? And so I really think we're suffering from a crisis of environmental illiteracy, especially in the United States, right? We don't think about it. We turn on our taps, the water comes on, like it's what it is, right? And even with what happened in Flint, everybody thinks, well, that happened to those folks over there. The presentation we were talking about Michigan, right? And, that happened to those folks over there. But let's be clear, right? As Spencer pointed out with those maps, this is a fact that I shared at my TED Talk. It's been in Reuters, like this is knowledge, but we don't read, we're Americans, right? But there are 3,810 locations in the United States with more lead in their water than Flint, Michigan. And when I shared this fact in my TED Talk, it went viral. People are like shocked, like, what do you mean? Like, oh my God, what are you talking about? Our infrastructure is almost 100 years old in the US, right? But we think of water as a third world issue. And it's not, like it is, but it also, right, is impacting communities right here in the United States. There are people here in this country who actually don't have water, right? Who are trucking water in and all of these things that we see that are impacting communities. So Guardians of H2O is designed to bring environmental literacy into classrooms K through 12. It's a nationally accredited curriculum, and we just teach people to think about it, make the connection between the water cycle and how does the water get into your home and what happens in that last mile between the water treatment plant and your home's tap. Marla's in Seattle, right? So we have the Aqua score on our one of the algorithms that we have. And so you put in your zip code, it tells you the score. Well, most folks in Seattle are getting really high scores because they kind of have protected waterways and things, but it still has to go the last mile in those pipes to your home's tap. So if you have old pipes or there's corrosion or something's going on, you might have horrible, levels of lead, for example, coming out of your tap, but you wouldn't have a way of knowing that. And so we connect the dots for kids, especially, right? Because they're the generation, if we make it that long, past 2030, they're the ones who are going to be the innovators, solving these problems. So we connect the dots between the water cycle, what's coming out of your tap, how does that impact your health? How do different contaminants in your water impact, different organs in your body and things like that. So I just think it's about awareness and educating and empowering local communities to connect the dots. Because if we're not guardians of H2O, we won't survive on planet Earth.
I want to echo that and use a piece of language that I think is sorely missing in America. And I'll give an example that comes from water for this, which is maintenance. America doesn't prize maintenance. In fact, America has done something very funny with the word maintenance. The maintenance department in most institutions are the people who come fix broken things. They don't maintain working things. They fix broken things. That is not the way maintenance is supposed to be. Maintenance is maintaining things so that they don't break. So the average, this is a little bit dated, but the average loss of water in the United States between the aquifer and the tap is a shockingly big number. It's something like 30% on average. Now, the French actually are big on maintenance. They maintain nuclear power plants so that they never break down. They maintain their water system. So Paris's water system is incredibly old by American standards. And they lose less than 3% of their water between the aquifer and the tap. Why? Because they maintain. And so again, I know I'm speaking to business school students largely here. There's this love of innovation. I would like there to be a love of maintenance. I would love for there to be a love of taking care of things that already exist. And that loss of taking care of things that already exist is one of the worst cultural attributes we have. And these institutions, business schools in particular, have been advocates for moving fast and breaking things, for example. We shouldn't break things. The best thing we can do is not waste, not break. And then we can do amazing creative things in a well-maintained society. But maintenance has a terribly undeserved reputation in the United States as being unglamorous. Let's make it more glamorous and appreciate it and endow it with our care and our money, because innovation doesn't fix broken things. And if you want a good way to think about this, we could improve our infrastructure in lots of ways, or we could wait for it to be wrecked and then replace it entirely. And the former is not disruptive and not expensive, and the latter is a fortune. And they're fortunes we won't have if we wait that long. And so maintenance, if I could convince 8 people in this thing to think, you know what, I should look into maintenance as a career, it would be a triumph.
So you think, Spencer, are we suffering from a lack of branding that properly, a lack of making that sexy?
Yes. The French have awesome outfits for the people who work in maintenance jobs. Like, they have good jumpsuits. They have cool vehicles. They are well designed. Yes, we need good stories of maintainers, not just story. I mean, everybody reads Steve Jobs' biography. Nobody reads the biography of the people who took care to make things stay together. And those biographies, those stories need to be told. And that's true of our communities, the people who keep our communities together, the people who just show up and get to know everybody and fix problems before they're bad, or maintain societies before they fall apart.
It's a really excellent point, and it's not something that's talked a lot about. That's definitely going to be a key takeaway for me tonight. So we're going to switch to a new section here where we've talked about the problem. Let's talk about the futures and the solutions. So let's talk about the possible, or if you don't mind me riffing off of your company, Spencer, the probable futures. Now, we certainly can't predict the future, but we can look at a range of possible futures and what we might do to impact them. So, Marla, I'll start with you first. What do you think is the most likely possible future And for our water system, or for how we're tackling this interconnected system. And what are your thoughts about how we can continue to support that?
Well, I think Spencer had such a great lead in for how I would answer this question. We're trying to prepare communities where we work to mitigate for the climate change that is already happening. So we're teaching them to look everywhere for water that is lost or wasted, making them more efficient users of their water so that they can reduce the pressure on, overdrawn or scarce water resources while, providing services to more people. So that means putting meters on water system, finding and fixing leaks, loving maintenance, not waiting for things to break, actually maintaining water systems. So in the countries where we work, the losses in the public water systems due to leaks and also due to unmetered illegal connections are as high as 60%, 70%. Actually, people don't know. These are guesses. We also need to, I think, reduce the unsustainable use of groundwater. In Ethiopia, we drive by these massive greenhouses that are growing fresh flowers that are bound for the European market. These are watered with groundwater, and these greenhouses are staffed by people that don't have water at their homes. This problem starts to compound then as the groundwater table drops, takes more energy to pump the water up. So, I think we need to think about our individual actions and how we're making things worse for people in Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa, water scarce regions of the world. And Spencer's going to be a better person to talk about this, but I think we need to look at how we price water for uses beyond our basic needs. If it takes 500 gallons of water to make a hamburger, maybe that should be reflected in the price that I pay for it.
So what are your thoughts about our possible futures that are ahead of us?
Yeah, our work really piggybacks on a lot of what Marla was talking about. Folks think about water usage, water conservation, water leakage. But if you think about in the developed world, in the United States specifically, anytime there's a water main break, water's leaking out, things are getting in. Whatever's in that soil, whatever's in the air, the historical use of the land, agricultural runoff, these things are getting in the pipes and coming out of people's taps. They're drinking it. So we don't perish instantly in the Western world by drinking water, but over time, toxins are building up in our bodies and causing really crazy health impacts that we don't always link back to environmental factors. And so I really believe that, our work is partially raising awareness, educating, like I spoke of, but also our mission as a company at Aquagenuity is really to map all of the world's water. Google named me the International Woman of Water, which is that a thing? Who knew that was a thing? We're on the homepage of Google. I didn't know. My mom thought it was cool. But because they said we had already built the world's largest water database, but we don't have enough data. So the same way we track the weather, and we have, very complex kind of algorithms that can tell me if it's going to rain on my block in 15 minutes, we need the same thing for water. So we're building a future. We imagine a world where we can have real-time water quality forecasts, water shortages. We can use water as a predictor for climate change impacts in hyperlocal communities. That's the world we're trying to build. So we're taking these technologies that existed already, big data and AI and all this fancy sounding stuff, and applying it to something that really matters to our ability to exist on planet Earth, which is water. So that's the future we hope to build.
And I would echo both those. And this is one of the things I think is very doable. So if you talk about the use of data today, most of the use of data is humans watching other humans through machines. But we could just pay better attention to the physical world pretty easily, actually. I think that the people on this call watching this would be shocked to know how poorly we know how few weather stations there are in the world. I think they'd be shocked to know how few weather stations there are in the world. There are huge sections of the world where there is no reliable weather history data. It would not be expensive to collect. It would not be expensive to maintain, and yet it's never been collected consistently. And with good monitors of various kinds around the world, we could get to know our planet a lot better and keep track of it. And we keep track of, the number of people who retweet a tweet, but we don't keep track of all kinds of things in the physical world that are actually much more we could get better data about them. And the reason we know our history, the reason we know our climate, is because people took care to look around and record it. So people recorded temperature, tides, all these things for hundreds of years before we started using that data. They just wanted to know. And we could use that same care and attention in the world we live in to keep track of things. And we could do it now very cheaply, very accurately, and even with much less attention by putting sensors in lots of places that would really help the work that Marla and Dahl are doing and help people who live in places where they can't know right now their own climate or their own water. And so I do want to correct one thing. Probable Futures is not a company. It's actually an initiative. It's all pro bono. I happen to have been paid more money than a person should get paid. And so my wife and I are using all of our money to put this out into the world as a public good.
That's amazing.
Knowledge should be publicly available for free. And knowledge about our world, we believe, is one of the best things that humans have ever done. And so we're just trying to make that public everywhere on the planet. And so I showed you the United States, but it goes all the way from the Horn of Africa to Siberia. And the idea is that we should give people an opportunity to understand where they live. And if we invested just slightly more money in monitoring it and keeping track of it, in doing the kinds of things that Dahl and Marla talk about, whether it's in people's homes or in the fields or in the forests, we could know our world so much better than we know it now. And it's way more interesting than most people give it credit for. And it's tractable, like kids can get it. You heard Marla and Dahl both say that working with children can understand this. This doesn't require a PhD in physics. It requires a human body that pays attention and some amount of education. And so for aspiring entrepreneurs, physical monitors of the world and the ability to have better, more accurate irrigation, the ability to have less wasteful use of resources is something we desperately need and should be good at.
It's an amazing mission, Spencer. And, this is a really interesting conversation about data. Dahl, Spencer, you guys both touched on this. How are we going to use that data? How do you guys use the data for both of your missions to talk about forecasting, talk about what is going to be in the future? How do you talk about it and show people that these are the range of possible futures that are coming from the data we're seeing, and then get them invested in the one that's the positive outcome? And obviously there's many positive outcomes, but in the positive outcomes, how do you guys both approach that?
Well, I'll speak for myself first, because I haven't had much success, frankly. So I'm hoping Dahl will have a lot more to say. But the reality is people have known for a long time that these are issues and done nothing about it. I mean, really nothing. And so we're trying to generate change. And one of the ways that I think can be effective is actually to work with people who didn't work on this for a long time. And we need the people who have worked on this for a long time because they have expertise, but to work with people who haven't worked on it before, because what's going to happen is that a large number of people are going to start working on the physical planet for the first time. They're going to work on climate change, work on water, when they never did before and didn't expect to. And so Probable Futures is partly designed actually as a training guide for the millions of people who will start incorporating this into their work and think, well, I didn't study climate change, I can't work on climate change, or I didn't study water, I can't work. We need those people to move into this space and take responsibility for it. And so one of the main things to do is not to wait around for the government to change, but push the government to change through activism, but also move into our own work, this awareness, make ourselves aware and make it part of our work. And so one of the things I push against is the idea of there being a sustainability department at a company. That, like, sustainability is over there on, the 12th floor. That's where sustainability is. No, you wouldn't say that about the finance department. You wouldn't say that about the information department. So I'm old enough to know that there used to be a time when there was like one guy, it was always a guy who was the webmaster at the company. And he was like the one guy who knew how email and the internet worked. That must seem impossible now, because now everybody's responsible for information. We have to hurry up out of we've got a sustainability. They're like, Joe and Susan work over in sustainability. We got that covered. It needs to be part of the conversation from the C-suite or the executives all the way down. And so I start with trying to get institutions to move this out of a kind of ghetto into the center of the organization. Now, it may not guide everything you do, but not having an awareness in everything you do is just unforgivable, because this data is available. And so ignoring your water, like it's right here. It's every day. Saying, well, I don't pay any attention to water, it's not my job, just seems ridiculous when you say it out loud. And we should treat the physical climate that way, which is that it should be in risk. Risk is an important idea, not maximization. And it's been lost in a lot of business because we've had such good times. And then the second is having it not be in some narrow discipline that's part of the ESG department, but actually it's the company's or the organization's business. That's my plan. I don't know if it's going to work. We launched yesterday, but I've been working on this for a while. I've had a fair amount of success working anonymously with high profile executives, and it's public that I've been advising McKinsey on this. But I think it's effective, and getting people to see the world around them that they hadn't paid attention to is a doable thing.
Absolutely. It's an awesome plan. It's going to work, Spencer. Absolutely. The story I always tell in answer to your question is the last speech that I gave before the pandemic, literally like days before the world figured out that we were all going to be in our houses for 6 months or more, was at a conference in New Orleans called the Guardians Summit. And it's hilarious because we literally have a trademark, Guardians of H2O. And what I spoke about was this quote. They say that water is to the 21st century what oil was to the 20th century. And that's been in Fortune and other publications. And it's this idea of no one could get the oil out of the ground consistently, right? In the late 1800s. And so who knew what can you do with it? We don't know, because we'd never had an ongoing supply. But once they figured out how to do that, industries and airplanes and cars and everything that we know in modern society became possible. Another analogy to that is the internet. No one kind of knew what it was, and it's just a thing. What are you going to do with the internet? In 1993. But once we had it, all of these other use cases came out. And this exact same thing is true for this type of data, this type of awareness of existing data, and then building more data and data sets and using analytics and such on top of that data for the environment, for the planet, paying attention to our physical world. There's so many use cases. So just in the conversations that we have with Fortune 50 companies, there's so many use cases. The obvious use cases are like food and beverage companies. Obviously they want to make sure that what they're using is good, but also the effluent on the back end of manufacturing processes for oil and gas companies, automotive companies, all these different industries. They are now liable, right? If you're polluting your local environment, energy companies, and they don't really have a way to track, measure, monitor. So we're finding folks wanting to use our database for all these different industries, but even like insurance, right? So how do you better assess the value of farmland based on historical use of the land or agricultural runoff, or if there used to be a factory here 30 years ago, is there lead in the soil? All these different types of things. There's so many use cases that we wouldn't think of. Another partner that we're working with is Zillow. Consumers right now, you search for a home by traffic or crime or school ratings, right? Well, now you'll be able to search for a home by water quality or by climate change. That's a new algorithm that we're introducing, kind of a climate score. So imagine how it just changes how you live when you have better information about your home environment, your local environment, the physical world around you. So the use cases are really endless. And that's what we've discovered in doing this work. So we just gather more data, make it really easy for people to access. And then the use cases are endless.
And let's talk about who's using this data, right? Let's talk about the players. You know, we have governments, large corporations, new innovators, new innovator, companies, startups, and then we have the average citizens. So who can vote with their ballots as well as their dollars and take individual action. So, Marla, I'll pass it over to you. What are you seeing in the communities that you work in where they might not have as much access to information or to data, but they are taking action, and they can take action within the smaller communities they're in?
Yeah, people do take action. What we really see when a community has a water system, we can help them connect a lot of things to that water system. I think Dahl said it. I mean, it's really all about water. It's a great foundation to build community activism. We see communities organizing to protect their watersheds, to advocate for water access for their neighbors, and we see them taking actions in regions so that they can together have a bigger impact on being better stewards of their environment. I mean, we work with people who they need water to survive. So when they understand that conserving soil and having trees on a watershed and fixing all their leaks is going to help them to have their meet their daily water needs, to be able to send their girls to school. I mean, all of these benefits flow from it. They see immediate value in this, and they do the things that they need to do. So I'm just a big believer in grassroots efforts. I think the same kind of approach can happen anywhere. It doesn't just have to be in poor communities. And I think, it just sounds cliche, but this is a problem that is going to require all of us working together toward a common good. I don't think in the past that we have been very good at solving these problems of interconnectedness, because we tend to not address the underlying causes of the problem. We also tend to only care about things when we're forced into a crisis or if we're impacted directly. So, my message, not just for people in the poor communities where we work, but to all of us, let's look at root causes. Let's invest in long-term generational changes because we choose to, and not because it's convenient, not because it wins an election, not because it has short-term profits. Pay attention to data. Listen to people who are experiencing the climate crisis firsthand, and maybe be willing to sacrifice our own lifestyles for the greater good. Something I like to say is, we're just not going to Shark Tank invent our way out of this one. The solution to this is not going to be easy. It's not going to be cheap. It's not going to be fast. It's going to require an investment of our time and all of our resources.
And what I would say about that is, and I agree entirely, is we have to decide that it's worth it to have a good life. And if we decide it's worth it to have a stable climate and civilization as we know it, or as we hope it could be, even better version of it, the notion that it should somehow be free, like that we shouldn't want to pay for it or we shouldn't want to sacrifice for it, just seems silly. The idea, I think that like I worked in finance for a long time, and I have a PhD in economics. I've heard so many win-win strategies. I can't count them all. If you require life to always be win-win, you're going to have a very narrow life. Sometimes you have to give something up, but it's worth it. And so the notion that there won't be sacrifice, why would you want to live a life that doesn't have some difficulty to it, where you don't have to put yourself out there? But the compensation for that, and part of the answer that's been in both what Marla and Dahl have said, is just stop thinking of yourself only as an individual. It's so lonely just to be an individual. We are part of a system. Some of that system is the physical system that is our companion at all times, but also we have neighbors, we have friends, we have people we haven't met. We're parts of organizations. And so we're not going to solve any of these problems by ourselves or with some magic bullet or some, and even just think about the American idiom there, right? A magic bullet. Like the idea that some sort of magical violence is going to be the thing that solves the problem. No, but living a life where you're connected to other people makes new successes possible, makes you more physically aware, less lonely, and then shared sacrifice is actually what makes people feel good together often. Suffering sports team bases, like, okay, Atlanta is full of people who keep waiting for their team to be, yeah, look at her. But it's this shared sadness for years that if it finally is overcome is quite joyous. There are forms of being together that don't require everybody winning all the time. And if we can accept those are part of humanity. And so embracing a richer form of humanity that acknowledges you won't always get paid for doing the right thing, and that's okay, strikes me as something that it's astonishing we've lost. I mean, we really had to work hard to get to a world where I will only save the world if it pays me, is essentially the American corporate mantra. That is truly insane. And so I think we can give that up. Nobody would have said that in 1950. Like nobody would have said that in 1950. And so we've gotten to that point. We can walk it back. We can walk that back to a point where we say, you know what, we all got to chip in and we're in this together. Like that doesn't seem like it's too heroic.
And I want to go back to some of the things that you mentioned, Marla, about the grassroots. Like, what are you all seeing that in any kind of community, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the types of community, Marla, that you've been working in, that the average citizen, like what actions are the average citizen taking that are actually working that you guys are seeing right now? And Marla, maybe that is, maybe you can, share more about the communities you work with, but, it could be within a city environment. It could be with any type of environment. Oh, you're on mute. Oh, no, Marla, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. One of my favorite examples of what individuals can do, I've been working in Honduras the longest out of all the places where we work. Groups of communities have come together there to protect their watershed. They've collected a small amount of money every month. It's part of the water bill. Every community we work with, they have a water connection, they pay a water bill. A portion of that water bill actually, they decided, these communities on their own, this wasn't anything that we required them to do. This was a policy change that they undertook on their own because they understood the importance of protecting the watershed. So they started making that part of their water bill. And with that funding that they have each month from every single household, they were able to purchase more and more land around their watershed, fence it, hire people to, kind of like park rangers to monitor that the activities that are happening on that land, that it's not being grazed, people aren't living there, people aren't using the trees. This watershed is now, it's giant. 150 communities and 8 different municipalities depend on this large watershed for their drinking water. This all started with one water project and an organized community. As new water projects came, also relying on the same watershed, they joined in this effort. So, I've just seen what what small communities with a largely, not formally educated population can do when they've decided it's worth it, when they know their lives depend on it.
And I want to go ahead and bring up a question brought up by one of our audience members. I know we were going to save these to the end, but it's relevant to what we're talking about right now. And the question is, having individuals understand the direct consequence of their actions on others, other generations, others living in different geographic areas, et cetera, is important. However, education alone does not necessarily trigger change. How can we trigger those changes in individuals' actions, carrot versus stick approach, and how do we get our elected officials to take action on our behalf? It's a great question.
Yeah, I want to dive in here because this is, now become all of our life's work, right? But one of the things that I've learned, I have a entertainment background. So most of the people that I went to school with, people in my family, these people have Grammys, like it's ridiculous, Oscars and things, like what is that about? And I am a singer, turned down 3 record deals, just instead went to Harvard, like why? And studied data science at MIT. Who knew? But in this work, I have learned that it really is about, one of our hashtags is data to the people. And another one is humanity over everything. Like Spencer was talking about the humanity, and how Marla was talking about the power of a small local, hyper local community coming together. We have, someone should do a history. I feel like, Spencer, you should write this book. Where are your books? Of what we did to ourselves in the 20th century, this idea of hyper-capitalism to the point where we think some big entity over there is going to deal with every issue and problem that we face. There is no solution to water that's not a hyper-local solution. Water is not a political issue, it's a human issue. It's one of the things that I said in Forbes and elsewhere. It's really about, and again, this is from not just anecdotally, but all the conversations I've had with Fortune 50 companies, Coca-Cola, we were in the bridge community. Google is one of our partners. Amazon is one of our funders. SoftBank, who made Uber and Slack, and we work into billion-dollar companies. They've invested in our company. So I talk to these folks day and night, and I'm telling you that when individuals have information and they're made aware. So in some communities, they physically have to live with it, right? They turn on the tap, nothing happens, or they're in an indigenous community and they know that they don't have access to water. But when the individuals become aware of the problem and they collectively raise their voice and they're not allowed to be isolated, corporations and governments change their behavior. This is just reality. One of the heads of sustainability at the largest beverage company in the world that I just named, he said to me, look, if not even 100,000 people, if 10,000 people can see our aqua score as a company, then we have to care about our aqua score. So just putting information in the hands of people really changes the behavior of these larger institutions and organizations. It's what it is. So the more we make it easy, the more we use tools like data, like the media, and really educating people about what's happening in our communities. Think about it this way. If there's 4,000 Flints in the United States, lead is a neurotoxin. So if I'm being exposed as a child to lead from K through 12 or whatever it is, that's gonna interrupt my brain development. I might not do as well in school. My educational outcomes are lower. So that determines what I do after high school, right? Whether I try to go to college or not, I'm gonna get lower outcomes, which is gonna determine my income opportunities, the jobs that I'm able to get, which is gonna determine, all these things that we see in terms of inequity and such can be traced back in too many communities to environmental factors, air pollution, water pollution, and such. It's not okay, right? We should not be okay. Humans should not be the sensors alerting us to water quality problems. So if you just bring that information to people and tap into that humanity, they raise their voice collectively, corporations and governments change. That's the reality.
Well, what about when we get that information to the hands of the corporations? I know, Spencer, you're talking to some of these larger organizations. What are you seeing?
So I'll say a couple of things. First, to answer the question directly about individuals, I think it's important to understand that all of us are, even as individuals, we are parts of communities, and we're sending signals to people all the time. And so don't underestimate that you're changing your behavior can change the behavior, affect the behavior of other people around you. And so you're not as alone as you think you are, and changes you make in the way you behave are likely to be signaled to other people. And we see this over and over again in lots of things, but think of yourself as a member of different communities. And so even in individual action, if you make it open, talk about it. I don't think there's a really great role for shame in any of this. Shame generally shuts people down, but helping people understand, I think there are two mindsets that I want to encourage. One is that fear is actually motivating. Anxiety is demotivating. Anxiety is a sense of like, there's bad stuff out there, and I don't know what it is, but I feel terrible, and so I'm going to watch Netflix. Like you try to opiate yourself against it. But fear, you can name. It's specific. You want to do something about it. So I do think there are forms. I don't want to praise data too much, in the sense that there's lots of data, and a lot of it I don't know what to do about. It just makes me feel kind of nauseous. But other data, I say, I'm afraid of that thing. I can name that thing. I know what it is, and then I can act on it. I do think there's something about that. And then the second is the difference between hope and optimism. So optimism is a sense that it'll just work out. I don't need to worry about it. I'm going to stay in my lane, and the rest of it, I'm just not going to worry about. Whereas hope, and I like the writer Rebecca Solnit's work on this, which is that optimism is kind of lazy and pessimism is lazy. But in between is this hope that makes space for agency, makes space for us to do something about it. And so as individuals, I think there's a demeanor we can have, which is a kind of hopeful, I can make this better. There's a sharing of what we're doing. And then there's an understanding that if I do these things, it may take time for other people to adjust, but you will be influencing other people with your behavior. So think of it not as just your one, whether your drops of water or your carbon emissions or how much they affect, but changing your life is hard, and doing so in ways that are conscious, people pay attention to. It takes courage and imagination. That's why I stress those two words. And I've spoken to, in intimate settings with the most prominent CEOs in the world, and said, look, all I'm asking for is courage and imagination. And they're like, no one has ever asked me for those two things. Like in business, no one has ever asked me to do those two things.
Do they get excited though?
Yes. And they're like, that's like, I'm a person. Nobody treats me like a person in my job. They treat me like a money machine. I say, well, you're a civic person. You're a part of this world. And I'm asking you to engage as a human being, not as a CEO. And these problems, one of the things I think is different about these problems, makes them hard in a business setting, is that most people leave their work at the office. They think this doesn't really have anything to do with my kids. This doesn't. I worked in finance where people say, I have to have an emotional fortitude to trade stocks because it's so stressful. It is stressful. It's a particular kind of stress. But let's take Coca-Cola. Being long Coke and short Pepsi may give you a stomach ache, but it doesn't change your relationship with your 6-year-old daughter. But you know what? Emitting carbon changes your relationship with your 6-year-old daughter. Not taking an interest in your public watershed changes your relationship with your 6-year-old daughter. You are responsible for that person. And if we're not taking care of the people who come after us, we're failing our role as stewards of society. And few people talk in these terms. We've separated corporations from modern life and separated their roles from their persons. And then when these things like ESG come up and we say, we should treat women better. Well, let's have a department for that. As opposed to, let's be better people. And there are some things where you need to have a department to take it seriously and institutionalize it. But there's a certain amount of taking agency, changing your behavior, and making people aware, hey, I'm not shaming you for this, but I'm changing the way I'm living because of these things, that I think is very powerful and can lead to tremendous change. And we underestimate that. And then in terms of how businesses react, I'll tell you now a very much more straightforward and transparent thing. So I'm approached often by people who run large hedge funds. And here's their concern. They're like, this climate change stuff is terrifying because the worse climate change gets, the bigger the government's going to get. And these are people who don't like government. But one of the things they recognize is in chaos, the government gets bigger because corporations cannot solve chaos. And so I've had some of the most famous hedge fund managers in the world reach out to me and say, will you please help stop climate change? Because I want to run a finance business and I don't want to live in a world of chaos. Because you know what happens in world wars? The government takes over business. Because right up until World War II, the British corporations were selling munitions and resources to the Nazis. Until the government forced them to stop, they couldn't stop themselves. And so this is why I tell corporate leaders, you have to beg for good regulation. And this may feel totally out of character, but you would be better off in a well-regulated world than a world where over time, you're just not going to have the trust of people, and the government will be asked to take responsibility away from you. And over time, the wiser, smarter executives can see that. They can imagine that. And that is easier to imagine in other parts of the world that have not been as prosperous. Having a German person or a Chinese person imagine bad outcomes is not that hard. Having somebody who grew up in Greenwich and now runs a big company in New York, it's kind of hard for them to imagine really bad things. So part of the role of Probable Futures is telling stories that make it clear, like, okay, what do you think? Use your imagination. What do you think is going to happen? It's why, for example, we remove the national borders from our maps. You can add them, but we don't put them in there because thinking, well, that's over in Mexico or that's just in Honduras is completely naive. We are connected to those people.
And we just had a question come in from one of our audience members here. What should we be asking of our governments, right? We see the droughts and the fires, but what should we be asking of our policymakers? And as you kind of, I think that was prompted from your story of talking to the leader at that hedge fund.
So I would say two things. One is we're at a stage where no matter the level of the elected official, they should have an answer for what are we going to do about our physical world, whether it's your city councilor, whether it's your school principal, whether it's your mayor, your congressperson, at every level, they're responsible for oversight, and the physical world needs to be part of that. So I'll say something to give a little sizzle. This is one of the things I think was bad about the Clintons. The Clintons were obsessed with jobs and money. Everything was about jobs and money with the Clintons. Well, you know what? Just because like measuring the whole world in jobs and money is a really bad way to think about the world. But we've now got a political system that is almost entirely arguing about money and not about the physical world or the social world we live in. And so asking your town councilor, your city councilor, what's the plan for climate here? Like, it's getting hotter. We're all needing air conditioning, or our water quality is lower. If we literally democratize that responsibility, it'll filter all the way up. And so I think that asking every public official to have a plan is a good place to start. If they don't have a plan, and most of them don't, it's a bad starting point. Just starting to get them to say, all right, what's the plan? And if they don't have a plan, you say, how can I help you get to a plan? What can we do to get a plan together? What I discovered I took a survey of CEOs. I had access to lots of CEOs. I said, what questions have you asked about climate change? And they're like, what do you mean? And I said, well, do you find climate science useful? They're like, no, I've never used it. I said, well, ask a question. Ask one question that's relevant to your business about climate. Nobody ever asked them to ask a question. They had judged it as not relevant because it all seemed to be about the future or abstract or people in Honduras. I said, just ask one question. Get them to start asking questions about their physical world and see where that goes. And almost nobody asks them those questions.
Yeah, I'll piggyback and say, I feel like people in those positions, they don't know what they don't know, especially politicians, right? We just really don't engage in these issues. And it goes back to that environmental literacy. I mean, who's having these discussions, right? Who even knows enough information to ask an intelligent question, let alone formulate a plan. So I really feel like, I applaud, Marla and Spencer, the type of work that we do, and really just educating people or making them aware of these issues, giving them an entry point into the subject matter, right? again, imagine a world where people didn't know about finance, the things that we're more familiar with. You can't ask a question or have an economic plan and you've never been exposed to finance. So the same thing has to happen here in terms of just basic environmental literacy. It really does shift the needle for individual citizens as well as for, government leaders as well. They just have to be educated.
Well, and I would go even further. And maybe this is what you're saying, Doll, is that, when I look at our elected leaders, we have a lot of attorneys, we have a lot of business people, and that's fine. But we want people from diverse backgrounds in our leadership when we're trying to make complicated policy decisions. So, so many of our challenges now have a scientific or technical component. So I'm an engineer by training. That's my bias. I would like to see more engineers and scientists in Congress as our president. Why not? And the other thing that I think about when I think about our political leadership is, what I have seen, what we've all seen, we've talked about this today, is in terms of U.S. water policy and investment, is that it kind of more closely mimics what I see in developing countries in terms of equity. So I think as individuals, we need to be demanding equity from our leadership. A situation like Flint, that would never happen in Seattle. It wouldn't, because Seattle's a wealthy city. The Line 3 pipeline project, that would never go through the Catskills. So I would pay close attention to where investments are being made and look at equity. I'm looking at equity around the world, but we need to look at it here in our country too.
So if I can offer a parable that happens to be important in my life and true, I thought the problem with Detroit was bad car companies when I was a kid. That just seemed like the answer. Like the car companies made pretty, can I say shitty on this? They made shitty cars. Okay. They weren't very attractive. They didn't work very well. And people in Detroit were suffering. This seemed like it was pretty closely related. So I started trying to figure out, well, where do they make better cars? Where is society? Where is there a middle class? Where do working class people have good jobs? And the answer was in Germany and in Japan at the time. This is in the late 80s. And I moved on to other questions along the way. And then later I met a guy who had been a consultant at Boston Consulting Group for all of the major auto companies in the world. And I said, there are a lot of explanations, but the weirdest thing is just like Detroit. I was a quality control engineer at Ford in 1989, and quality control engineers at that time were at the end of the assembly line. The car was already built. We were somehow supposed to put quality onto an already built car. And I said, it's just the craziest thing. I don't understand what happened to the culture of these places. And he said, oh, the answer is very simple. After the 1960s, the CEO of every American auto company came from the finance or marketing department. And the CEO of all the other auto companies came from engineering. And in engineering, there was truth. This is the car we intended to build. This is the car we built. If it's not the same, we need to fix it. And what I saw at Ford in Hapeville, outside near where Dahl lives, was the Ford Taurus came off the assembly line and it just wasn't very good. And nobody was actually that interested in making it better. And so what they did was say, how can we sell it now? Like, not how can we make it better, but how can we monetize a mediocre sedan? That was the question that Ford took on. And what it did was it created financing, it created marketing, it created fleet sales, it actually bought a rental car company so it would have a captive buyer who would have to buy the Ford Taurus that nobody wanted to buy. If you maintain some standards that are objective in the way that engineering provides them, in the way the natural world provides them, finance is fungible. You can start messing around with the income statement and the balance sheet in ways that give you creative license. And we've financialized way too much of life. And it's left these physical standards that are just accurate, are true. The measurement that Dahl and Marla are talking about it's like how much lead is in the water. It's not how much is that lead worth. which then can maybe have a discount rate and you could finance it and leverage it and you could maybe offset it with some investment. No, it's just like literally the molecules of the grams of lead or whatever the measure is, the atoms of lead. What are they? And that kind of objective, non-financial reality is one of the biggest things we've lost. And I think that it can be reclaimed pretty easily, pretty straightforwardly. The cultural part of that is hard, but the non-cultural part of it is just, let's count them. It's just counting. You don't need to have the Black-Scholes theorem to figure out the options pricing of this thing. It's counting. And I think that we've lost that. And that is part of why the same thing happened with maintenance. The same thing happened in this culture of counting the dollars instead of the things, abstracted away from physical reality. And we can get back to that.
We've talked a lot about the solutions that individuals, governments, corporations, questions they can ask. But I don't want to end the night without speaking more about what the three of you are working on, because all three of you are actually part of the solution right now, and you're actively doing work that is moving us forward. So, Marla, you've helped, I think I have the count from yesterday. It's probably increased in the past 24 hours to 243,244 people gain access to clean water. Guys, you can go check her website. I think it's probably gone up since then. What's on the horizon for Water First? What's the next stage of the journey here?
Well, we're over 250,000 now. So we've reached a really nice milestone. Decades ago when I started in this work, we did something that other organizations weren't doing. We believe that poor communities were quite capable of maintaining complex piped water networks that were metered, that made measurements of things like, how much flow is there at the water source, understanding what to do when they tested water quality, how, if they got a sample back that said they had coliform, a kind of bacteria in their water system, what do they need to do to react to that? We believe poor communities were very capable of managing their water resources, and we invested in that with high quality systems. The idea is that we would make an upfront investment and it would last. That we would teach communities to have a love of maintenance, as Spencer put it, investing in keeping their systems working. So we have decades worth of data to show that this approach is successful, that you can bet on investing in these very poor communities that lack. Most people that I work with have not even reached the 6th grade in terms of education, but they can tell you the income and expenses from their monthly water bills. This is a problem. We're just one little organization in Seattle. This is a problem that impacts billions of people worldwide, is not going to be solved by us. We don't have that vision. So what's on the horizon for us now is just share our data. We've learned a lot. We have a different story to tell than many organizations that work in our sector. So we want to inspire other donors, governments, other organizations to think longer term and invest in making sure that everyone in the world has access to clean water.
And Dal, for you, what's the current biggest challenge that Aquagenuity faces as you pursue your mission to empower people with data to protect their lives, to help prevent water-related crisis? What's your biggest challenge and what's next on the horizon for you?
Yeah, I'm a millennial, and all of us were born after 1970 when the EPA was founded. So we grew up in a world where someone over there is taking care of these things. Like, we don't even think about it. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge. It's this idea that it's being handled. And then we see it in front of us that it's not being handled, but we've been raised to think it's being handled. So we don't really have the tools or even the mentality to address it differently. I think all of us need to step back into our individual power and take on a leadership role in our own homes, our own communities, around just educating ourselves and such. So our mission at Aquagenuity, obviously we're aggregating data, we're mapping water quality down to the street level, and we have great partners who are supporting us in that work. But I realized really early on, again, right after I started working, because I had no idea. I started this work because of Flint and my mentor, who's now 82 years old. He was the first African-American to have his own bottled water plant in the United States. He got an award from the Congressional Black Caucus, John Lewis, who's been my senator my whole life. Ambassador Andrew Young, who walked with Dr. King, is one of our advisors, a dear friend of mine and of our mission. And I learned from them, just sitting with them. You don't change people's hearts and minds, with policies and, what's right and what's wrong, but it becomes a movement when people can see that they have individual agency in change. It's what we've been talking about all day. You can make a difference when you change your behavior, and then your neighbor changes their behavior, and then the whole community, like Marla spoke of, changes their behavior. We all come together around a local school or a local church or a local water project. This is how we change the world. And I learned that from people who changed the world. It's 50, 60 years ago. So we're doing the same thing by using the tools of culture, that other side of, right? We need to count and measure the physical world, like Spencer was discussing. But then the cultural piece is not a light thing. So we actually are activating with entertainers and folks I grew up with and people in our network and people who want to make a difference. I bet no one on this call knows that Cardi B, several years ago, her Instagram was shut down because she was ranting and cursing about Flint on a video. Like she was going off, like, how come these people don't have water? This is crazy, right? They care. People who have this cultural influence, they really do care, but they don't know what to do. So if we marry those worlds, bridge those gaps, it's no different than the civil rights movement. They just put a camera on what people were doing in their homes and in those small meetings and in those churches. And they just put a camera on it, broadcast it to the world, and we changed society. So I'm learning from the greats, and that's our next, our goal. We're gonna activate 1 million guardians of H2O. And we're doing that with partnerships with these huge companies and the folks who make this device right here, I'm not allowed to say, and folks who have franchises in different locations where we can activate people, educate them in places where they already go to school and go to work and go to get food every day. And we're empowering them, you can make a difference. And then they take that back to their communities. And together, we create a cultural shift where it becomes crazy. What do you mean you don't know what's in your water? It becomes this weird, what's wrong with you? You haven't checked your water score in your community? Like, what, you don't know your local watershed? What's wrong with you? That can be our reality in 10 years when we leverage media, culture, influence. And so I believe that that's how we change the world. So we're working with some of these streaming networks, coming soon to a streaming device near you. We'll be documenting a lot of this work, but I truly believe that this is how we'll change the world.
I mean, that's so exciting. We can't wait to hear about it. So we're gonna follow up with you on that. And Spencer, we've learned a lot about probable futures this evening. And what would you say to encourage the impact community to think about, in terms of taking action and what? I don't want to ask you what's the next step for you because it launched yesterday, but. What would your call to action to be those that are listening this evening?
Sure. And you may be surprised how much I say the same thing that Dal just said. We need better stories. We tell too few and too narrow stories about the future. And there are two kinds of stories that we need to be comfortable with. Americans stopped telling stories of tragedy a long time ago, just stories of success. Tragedy used to be a main form of entertainment education. We need to familiarize ourselves with the kinds of losses that can be possible, and then tell better stories about what's coming and what can be. there are essentially two kinds of stories about the future right now. It's sort of just like now, but somehow there are electric cars, or it's apocalypse. So you got like Mad Max and Gattaca. Like that's all you got is like this. Neither of those are nearby. They're not the worlds the young people watching this are going to live in. We need better stories. And so the reason we called this Probable Futures is there's a range of futures that are possible. We need to stop we need to stop just hoping for ones that are not going to happen, because we're not going back to that same climate. And take something very simple. Nobody in the United States or anywhere in the world now has the right storm sewer. All the storm sewers were built for the wrong rainfall expectations. That may seem super boring, but boy, oh boy, do we need better stories. So I was consulted by a very famous movie maker who wanted to make a movie where Bradley Cooper and Jennifer Lawrence fell in love and was about climate change. And I pitched some ideas about things like a storm sewer or mortgages or where they would live or how they would have kids or lots of things. And you know what we're going to get? We're going to get an asteroid movie that comes out this year. And I was like, we don't need another metaphor. We need a story about the actual world that we're actually living in that is accurate and that we can want to live in. And I would say these better stories need to come from artists, need to come from storytellers, need to come from novelists. They also need to come from places like business schools that motivate people to do things. I spoke with a guy the other day who said, I'm trying to invest in companies that will take carbon out of the atmosphere. I think I'm invested in all of them that currently exist. He said, but I know all these entrepreneurs who want to start a business, and if we had a better story for them about why to do this, about the world they could live in where they started a business that was good for the world, they would do it. But instead, all of them are starting finance and media companies because those are the stories they know. And so even these prosaic commercial stories, we need ones that have the physical world in them and that are in the range of possibilities that are likely. And so that's what I would say is start thinking about better stories. And when you hear a 50-year-old person like me, 52-year-old person or older, tell you how the world's going to be, don't trust them. Say, all right, I know a lot about the future. I'm going to plan a future that has space that is in that space that is probable. And imagine a world that we can live in that way. And I'm hopeful we're going to live in a more challenging world physically, but we could live better in it. And having better stories for that is a way to get there.
It's such a good note to end on. I feel like something that everyone relates to, the narratives that we tell. Well, we're going to wrap up for the evening. I want to thank everyone who submitted questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions this evening. We always have more than we can cover. We want to respect our experts' time. Spencer, Dahl, Marla, thank you so much for being here with us. You guys should see the amount of notes that I've taken tonight. Narratives, access to data information, focus on agency, the impact in our local communities. This is all incredibly important. At Impact, we like to end with a call to action. So please share what you've learned this evening with your friends, your families, your colleagues. I think we've heard that from our three experts this evening. We'll be sharing tonight's conversation on the Impact website. So please visit us at impactpsf.org. And check out all the other impact programs and follow along as we tackle some of the most critical civic and social issues. Thank you again to Bold Business and the Board of Directors of Impact, our experts and our guests. We will see you next time and have a great evening. Thank you all.